Michael. Evan. Chase.
Here.
Brandon.
Here.
Okay. Dawn.
Here.
Michael.
Here.
Michael. Sorry, Cody. David. Aaron.
Here.
Danny.
Here.
And Joshua. Josh. I apparently cannot speak today. So, where we want to pick up today is kind of where we left off yesterday. So you definitely want to bring them to code with the pet adoption project again. We're going to kind of do a few more pieces with that. So, if you saw the broad overview of what we're talking about today, there's kind of three things we want to do. One is we want to talk about status codes, which will be pretty easy, pretty short. We're going to talk about tracking. How do we track who made the changes? And specifically what we want to track is what was changed, when it was changed, and who changed it. Okay, so we want to know what was changed, when it was changed, and who changed it. And the third question is enhancing our auth middleware. So there's a little bit more we want to enhance that middleware with because we're going to use that going forward with React. Okay. Do you have everybody's attention here? Josh, you heard that kind of summary? Okay, good. So that's kind of the three topics and the areas that we're going to be looking at today. Okay. I want to give you guys 5.1. I have been teaching kind of Evan's class this week. He's out. So I'm teaching his morning class in addition to this class this week. So I don't have 5.1 to give you yet. So I can give you some pointers about what you kind of need to do. They're kind of at the last page of the handout. If you look at that, actually most of the guidance for what you're going to be doing for 5.1 is in that last page. I just haven't gotten it all into kind of a lab format yet. So that, unfortunately, I don't have for you today. I need to try and do that tonight, so you have that definitely for tomorrow. So usually I have some office hours at the beginning where I usually get some of these things sorted out and a bunch of other things to do this week. So I do apologize for that, but we'll try to get to that tomorrow. So talking briefly about just kind of theory stuff, namely with the status codes. So if you look at here, you should have a page that I gave you on Monday related to HTTP status codes. Okay. So status codes that we've talked about so far, you remember that we've got 200, which is okay, right? 200, okay. And remember, these are kind of grouped into groups of 100, right? So 200 is okay. 500 is internal server error. Meaning that something went wrong on the server and it wasn't the client's fault. Something went wrong on the server and the client had no way of knowing or no way of preventing that error from occurring. Okay? So that means, oops, we goofed. In general, if you're sending a 500 error at all, that's usually a sign that there's a bug in your code or there's something you need to fix. Okay? So that's where the only place we're really sending 500 is in that centralized error handler that we have in the server.js file. That's if nothing else handled the error and we get here, then it's a 500. Does that make sense? So 500 is kind of a last resort, saying, we're sorry, we failed, contact the system administrator and maybe they can fix the website. But that's the kind of the worst case scenario. That's from the 200 level. This is from the 500 level. Those are actually all the ones we need to know from the 200 and 500 levels. Okay, which leaves the 300 level and leaves the 400 level. Okay, 300 level. Remember, those are 300 to 399. Those are all redirection codes, which is a way to send the user to another page. Okay, these oftentimes come up when you're denying the user access to a page. Okay, oftentimes we use those 300 level codes if you're denying the user access to a page. Because we're developing our API as one application and our front end as another, we won't be using any of the 300 codes this semester. Okay, because we're building these as two separate applications, that's not actually going to work out for us. 300 only works if you have kind of them all into one, right? So what we care about, what we want to talk about specifically today, that's just kind of review, is two more codes in this range. So remember, 400 to 499 is client side errors. Something went wrong, the client gave us bad data, the client shouldn't have done that. So if it's a 400 level, it's not the server's fault, it's not our code's fault on the back end, it's the problem with the front end. That's what we're saying. Okay? So we're saying that the front end did something wrong that it shouldn't have done, it shouldn't have made this happen. Okay? It's not our fault to fix that. So what are some of the codes that we've already seen in that 400 level, between 400 and 499? What are some of those ones that we've already used?
Yeah, 404.
Okay, so 404 stands for what?
Like it didn't find who you're looking for.
Okay, so specifically the standard message for that one is not found. So 404 says the resource was not found. Okay, so that can either be the case that the URL that you gave me is just invalid, it doesn't work for anything, there's nothing there. Or it could be that you're giving me like an ID for something that doesn't exist. It's really kind of the same thing, right? A resource and an HTML file not being there, like a user or bug not being there, is kind of the same thing as an HTML file not being there. So we send the same error message. What's another error code that we've got?
400.
400? Okay. What's 400 represent?
It's kind of similar to 404, but it's not like it doesn't exist. It's kind of like the server's going to process what was given to it.
Okay.
Does it say like bad request or something like that?
Yep, that's correct. So standard message, just like this is not found, 400 is known as bad request. Okay. 404 represents not found. 400 represents bad request. Remember that. Okay. Remember that. Bad request. So we're saying that the client, remember these are client errors, we're saying the client made a bad request, made an invalid request. We're saying I can't fulfill that because I can't do what you asked me to do. Does that make sense? So oftentimes those are errors, like we're throwing, anytime we have errors with joy, with the schema, we're throwing a 400 error because we're saying either you didn't pass me the required fields, you passed me things that I didn't allow you to pass, or you pass things in the wrong format and things like that. Does that make sense? So we're saying that the data that I received is invalid. I can't use that data. Does that make sense? And so we failed to do anything like that. So that would be a bad request. Good with that? It's worth knowing that 400 is a bit of a catch-all. In general, 400 you can put a lot of things into. A lot of things can be classified as 400, and it kind of be okay. It's worth breaking things out and using some of the other 400 codes, but a lot of times people end up lumping everything into just 400 and using only that code. Okay? So there are two other codes that I want you to take note of and write down and make note of. Those are the kind of two ones that are on this page. So 401 represents unauthorized. And 403 represents forbidden. .401 is unauthorized and 403 is forbidden. 401, that's really a misnomer. This shouldn't have been called unauthorized, but that's what it's called in the standard, in the official standard. Okay, so officially it's called unauthorized. That's actually incorrect. This should have been called unauthenticated. Is actually would have been the correct name for it. But at the time that this standard was kind of created, we hadn't really landed on the distinction in separating authentication from authorization. And in some sense, the division between authentication and authorization is a little bit murky. Okay, but that's really what this means. 401 is reserved for one specific purpose. It says you're not logged in. 401 says you are not logged in. That's what that's about. 401 says you're not logged in. 403 says you're logged in and I accept your credentials, but you don't have permission to do that. So 403 says, yes, you're logged in, but you can't do that. You don't have permission. Do you hear the kind of distinction, right? So 401 says, you need to be logged in to do this. You're not logged in. Or you've provided me an access token that isn't valid, so therefore I'm going to treat you as not logged in. Or 403 says, you don't have permission to access this. You're logged in. Your user is not allowed to do this. So for instance, maybe you're trying to edit some other user. If you are logged in, but you're not allowed to edit that user, you would get a 403. But if you're not logged in at all, you would for sure get a 401. Make sense? That's important, okay? That distinction is important. Like sometimes we want to send a 401, sometimes we want to send a 403. One of the things that kind of comes with this, if you send back a 401 status code to the browser, under certain circumstances, because there's different ways to do this, if you send back a 401 status code, then oftentimes the browser will pop a little dialog at the top with a username and a password. If you send back a 401, the browser will actually do this. It'll pop up a little dialog for you. Kind of looks like an alert. Remember using alerts and prompts in JavaScript? It's actually the same kind of dialog. It has a username and password field. Okay, if you send back a 401. So you're said, okay, it does that. This dialog is what we refer to as basic authentication. Okay, this dialog implements what they call basic authentication. I think I actually have a screenshot of it somewhere in here. If I go to the right page, There it is. So if you send back a 401 code, your browser will pop up a little dialog like this. You ever seen that? That's what's kind of like going on. In order to handle this dialog, what it sends back, we need to enhance our auth middleware, because our auth middleware doesn't know how to handle this one. It just knows how to handle cookies. Okay? So that's one of the things we want to talk about. That's kind of under topic point number 3. Okay? Everybody good with that? So I did something yesterday that I kind of need to fix, and I did it intentionally to try and say, okay, we'll come back to this. So one of the things I did yesterday is I returned a 400 code when I should actually return a 401 code. Okay. So now I want to show you where that is, and we're kind of going to start to see why that wants to be that way. But the reason I did that is like, hey, this we don't need to talk about this yet, and it won't break anything at this point. So under the pet adoption thing, up here at the top of the file, you say, I said, if there's not a request auth, it means you're not logged in. I sent back a 400 code, right? This is not actually a 400 error. What kind of error is this? This is a 401. So technically I should be returning a 401 at the top of that code. So I'm going to fix that real quick, because that would be the more accurate status code. Okay. Now, if I were to hit this with the browser, that would mean that it would pop up the dialog that you just saw. In Postman, it's not going to do the same thing. Postman is just going to say, okay, it's a 401 code. And not going to do anything special with it, just so we're clear. Okay? So it might seem like a minor thing. It makes more difference when we're talking about maybe the front end and such. So, cool. Change that to a 401. The next thing I want to do, so we've kind of talked about what those two status codes are. I won't be using 403 this week. 403 we'll talk about next week when we talk about authorization. Because we're not getting into permissions yet. You know, if you're this role, then you can do this. You can do this role, you can do this. We'll get into that next week. So 403 we'll talk about next week. I just want to make you aware of it and the distinction between the two. Okay? So let's talk about tracking. Okay. So when we deal with tracking, I'm going to turn this light back on. When we deal with tracking, anytime a user makes changes, in a lot of businesses, we need to keep track of what specifically has the user changed, how did they change it, when did they change it. So it kind of falls into the things we want to get is what did they change, when did they change it, and who changed it. So what we're trying to implement now is kind of a system that can track all that information. Okay, so let's break out and say, one of the things I want to do is maybe add a table that tracks all the edits, right? So let's say we have a table of edits or a collection of edits. So this is the edits collection. This is what I'm going to call its name. So edits collection. Okay. Anytime the user makes a change to the data, I want to write something to that, which has that information so I can go back and log it. Okay. So, what fields does this collection need to have? What fields does this collection need to have? Recognize the user can, at this point, edit pets, and they can also edit users. Okay? I want to track all the changes to both to this one collection.
So with our
strategy here with regard to
Mhm.
the structure of this.
Okay.
We have one document per bug, one document per user.
One document for every change.
Okay.
One document for every change. Because I want a full timeline of when and how everything has changed.
So my question was if it's going to be random edits for each document.
Each document is an edit. Each document is an edit. What were you going to say?
Yeah, probably the user, the way to get it.
Okay. And so I'm going to bundle that under auth. I'm going to actually just say, let's save everything from the payload, everything from the token. We'll just save that under key named auth. So that's the who. What else?
Probably the user ID or an ID of what they're editing.
Okay. What did they edit, right? So we need to know some sort of IDs about what they edited. And so like if it's nested inside of something, like the toys or kind of a nested document, then I might need to track both the toy ID and the pet ID. It might be worth one. Okay? What else? Okay. So like the edit date, okay, I'm going to call that the timestamp. I'm going to say, when did that happen? Because it may be an edit, it may be some other sort of operation. Any other data we need to collect?
What does auth represent?
That's going to be the user who made the change. I'm going to make that a nested document. That'll be pretty easy. The change itself? Okay. So typically we've been putting that into the update. So I'm going to add a key for update. Tells me what fields did they change and what did they change them to. What else? What are the things I don't know so far with that information?
Does update only contain the new values?
The new values.
Yeah, so are we going to want to store the old values? No.
That'd be a good question. Sometimes you may want to store the old values. I'm going to avoid doing that for this example because there's some additional complexity there. Okay. So I'm not going to store the old value. I'll just store the new value. It's good enough for my purposes. What else? If I just have this, do I know what collection I ended in? Okay, so that's the ID, but how do I know what ID that's for, right? What collection, what document is that for? I don't know if it's a pet, I don't know if it's a user, I don't know if it's a bug, I don't know if it's a whatnot. So I need to know like what collection did we work with. Make sense? So somewhere in here I need to say, hey, this is for the collection. Okay. And the last one I would add is we need to know some sort of operation. Namely, I want to know, is it an insert? Is it an update? Or is it a delete? Did they insert a document? Did they edit a document? Did they update a document? Did they delete a document? Okay. That kind of makes sense? So every time the user make a change, one of the things we want to do is save information about the edit. And you kind of see the information in the edit is going to be reasonably large, right? In fact, if we compare the amount of data that's going to be in the edits collection at this point, it's probably going to be bigger than our other two things. That's just kind of the nature of the beast. Everybody good with that? Okay. So this is this kind of common thing that comes up. And so I want to add that, and I need to update both of the update routes under the pet module for this. Okay? So we kind of finished yesterday looking at the self-service update, the /me. I also need to apply some of these changes to the user ID one as well. Okay? So where can this fit in? Well, the place I would stick this, I would say, well, after we've updated the database, maybe then the next thing I do is I track the changes. Okay? So what I want to do is here, hey, after we update, I might say const edit. I want to build up this document that I'm going to save. I want to say await insert or maybe save save edit. We're going to save that edit. Okay. So that's kind of my goal. I want to say, hey, let's create an edit, let's save that object, and kind of log it in. Okay. So now this method I haven't built yet. I haven't implemented that save edit method, right? That's going to need to work with the database, right? So before I come in and fill all the edit details in here, I'm actually going to go over to save edit and over to the database and import this. Okay, we'll come back. So over in the database module, I'm going to add this towards the end. Async function save edit. Here's the edit. Connect to the database. Return await db.collection. We're going to the new edits collection that we're about to make, and we're saying insert one. And I'm going to actually leave it as simple as that. I'm going to say most of the work of actually coming up with the edit really needs to be in the route. Yeah, I can. So there's my save edit function. So pretty simple. I'm just making a way to insert these into the database in a brand new collection. And I'll just export that. So we're going to export save edit from the database module. Okay. So we created a new method, we exported it, now we can actually use it. Okay. So everybody got that before I leave this file? I think I see some people typing. So most of this logic I'm asking how to move back over to the route itself. Unfortunately, this is not something that easily lends itself to, say, middleware, because it kind of has to happen in the middle of the route function itself. So I can't really easily just kind of say, well, break it off, because middleware has to kind of run before, typically. Has to run before the route. So this is something that requires a little bit more code duplication that isn't really easy to break out as easy. So I'm going to go back to the user module, okay, and now we want to build up that edit. Okay, so things we want in that edit, I'm going to start with the timestamp, maybe. Timestamp, new date, timestamp tracking when it happened. So that way I can kind of look and maybe sort the edits by time and see, okay, the user did this, and the user did this, and then the user did this, right? Yep.
Now, are we concerned about the date being slightly off? Or no?
It's close enough. It's close enough. I'm not concerned about it. So the timestamp is going to be there. You're right to ask the question, but I'm not going to worry about it here. Let's add the operation next. So I'm going to say op. This is an update because we just updated a user. The collection that I updated, and maybe I'm going to shorten this down to call, just because this is going to be a good sized, and maybe I'll shorten all the way down to just COL. This is going to have quite a few records in it, so I want to save a little bit on the length of the names. So call is this updated users. This is an update. We updated users. In terms of my IDs, we can see what user ID I updated. So I might add that. Okay. Now the problem with kind of putting user ID out here like this is it's kind of unclear of, is this the user ID who did the update, or is this the user ID who edited it? In this case, they're the same thing, right? But when we deal with the other route, they won't be. So I might want to do something where I kind of nest it a little bit deeper. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another level, call it target. So I say the target, here's all the IDs of what we edited. So I got target.userid is where the thing that we updated. I can also add in the update document, just like that. So checking off the things we've done. We've auth, collection, update, timestamp. We've got the IDs, and I finally named them the auth. So after all this is said and done, auth, request, auth. So that's going to give me quite a bit of information about what actually changed and who changed. Cool. So, I mean, the hard part here is just to figure out what data do we need to save, right? And how do we save it? And there's a bazillion different ways to do this, right? Is there one right answer? Absolutely not, right? This what you build out here is very, very context sensitive. You know, in one way, it's very similar from application to application. You probably use this in most applications to do it this way. But what you decide to call the variables and what you decide about the properties is really a choice. Does that make sense? So there's a bunch of ways to structure this. The important thing with this is to choose a structure and really think hard about that structure, because you're going to have to create these records in a lot of different places. And so you don't want to have to come back later and find out that, oh, we didn't track something that we should have tracked, right? That's the important thing to do, is just to make sure that you're tracking all of it. And so you don't have to come back later and change it. Okay, so let's give it a test. I'm going to go back to Postman. And kind of resume where we left off yesterday. I guess there's an update. So I'm going to try update this user. So I'm just going to hit send. Okay, thing is spinning. Could not connect. All right, I think I forgot to start the server. So npm run start dev. npm run start dev. So that's up and running. Try it again. Hit send. Now, notice it says you must be logged in. It worked yesterday. What happened? Yeah, the cookie expired, right? Our session expired. So we need to start a new session. Okay? So I'm going to use my login route that I saved yesterday. Pet adoption. And go down to user. And I'm going to just hit send on that. Okay. Invalid credentials. Did I change my password? I don't know what my password's now. Okay, so I will go to the database manually and just change it there. Unfortunately, I haven't built myself a password reset functionality. I'm wondering if I maybe left it in a state where the password is in plain text. Yeah, that's what happened. It's showing up as test user for me instead of an encrypted password. So I'm going to update that on the database side, and now my password should be back to password. Okay, so I'm logged back in. Okay. Put your hand up when you get logged in, just so I know everybody's here. Let's check. You logged in? You got an arrow in the chat face. No, look past it. Again, so you know the IGR for the post step. So the question is where is that? Server Ranken. Oh, that needs to be a string. The character is a string. That's the name of the package. Yes, that's a hash function. All of this. See if it has the same. See if you can get one again. So you're using the register one, okay? And you want to look at the stack trace. Stack trace, token JWT alpha. So you just only token at the beginning of the present point. That is on offline 12. So offline 12. That's in here is, and then just do it there. Okay. So, did it tell us anything about, I think I know what it is. So you're trying to access register? Oh, you're trying to access the pledge. Oh, yes, so it should be post. So you're trying to. So try it. Yeah. Try it. Do you know Alvin? Let's do it. Secret church. And that's a lot of fun. Those who are Chicago. So we're going to find out. So good reason to keep. You can get one there. Plus secret is not. So what would we need to find it? So we have a new file. Go generate yourself a new secret without special characters. That's what I'm doing. Let's see that. Okay. Do you have a cookie? Awesome. Do you have seven? Awesome. How's it going? I think the problem is that it looks like my story with HTTP. Yeah. Oh, okay. So the problem is you've got something. problem is your middleware is off, and your middleware is actually never passing on to the next middleware. So this stuff you have out here is in place. So we need to actually move that somewhere. So this stuff in here needs to be captured. The way that this is working. So this outer is a structure. That is a factory. Inside of there, this is the actual core. So the tri-cap is actually around basically. So here's within this inner function. The cache here occurred. So something is wrong here. So it's we're seeing this inner, this outer function, this outer function off. That one the program starts. So this inner function becomes and then you get the plus. And so yeah, that's what's causing. So go take a look at the database. You need to actual database. Go to Mongo. Look at the user you're trying to log in. So the password is just plain text password. You won't be able to log in. It has to be hashed. Because it's checking and assuming that it's all. Right? So fix that. Go back. Now you need to change this. So, if they do not have a second, you're still working on it. My guess is probably just have one. You'll probably generate a token. So generate a new hash and a password. Get that? If you go here, Michael, stuff that I just sent in Discord, stuff that in as the password in the database. And then you should be able to log in as with password. Okay. The reason, obviously I need to do that in order to use the route that we actually want to be using, which is to actually update myself. I'm going to go ahead and save this one. I'm going to say update me. So I want to update myself, which is HTTP localhost API user me. Because I have a cookie, I should be able to update myself. There we go. Now it says save edit is not defined. Okay. So I missed one thing that we need to do. At the top of the user module, you'll know I'm using the save edit method here. I need to actually go back up to the top of the user module and bring it in. I forgot to do that part. There we go. So it says user updated. So if you have that code in place, let me just check the database to see if this worked. Edits. There we go. So here's what I'm ending up getting into the database. If you want to take a look at my screen. This is kind of the end goal of what we just wrote. Because I want to say whenever I update myself, I'm going to track information about it. So I've got timestamp, update users, target, update, and the object. So you can see the fields that I changed. I changed the full name, I changed the password, those kind of things. Cool? Yes?
So we gotta create like an ID for each bit. Mongo do that for us.
Yeah, actually Mongo just created one. It's worth noting if you insert a document without setting the ID, Mongo will automatically check it. The reason that I've usually done it myself before I inserted it, because I often need that ID to do other things. In this case, I don't really care about that ID. I'm not going to do it. Does that make sense? So I don't really care about that. I'd rather just have one figure out this. Okay. Test that out. So what I want you to do next, I want you to take what we've kind of covered here. Actually, let me finish one thing here. If I can have your attention again. So one more thing we need to do in here is traditionally, I also want to save some information on the thing we changed as well. So not just a separate log of all the changes. I usually want to know like who's the last person who did it. Does that make sense? I usually want to know the last person who did it. So in addition to all of that, I want to know the last change. Like so far we've added like last updated field, but I also want to know like who did it, not just when it happened. Okay. So that's going to look something like this, right? Right between here when we're hashing the passwords and when we're actually inserting the user in the password, I need to kind of modify the update document to say, hey, there's some additional things we want to set, okay? Now, I'm going to choose to only do this if there's actually changes to be made, okay? If the user doesn't want to make any changes to the database, I'm just going to leave it alone and not add these fields. Is that clear? So I want to add an if statement in here. I'm going to say if something, okay? So if the update contains fields to change. This is not something we've really talked about at this point. What happens if, the update is just a single curly brace object? There's no properties on it, right? How can I know whether or not there's any properties on the update document or not? How can I find out? Huh? I can't hear you. Size or length? Okay. Unfortunately, an object has neither. It has neither a size nor a length. Like an array has a length, but there is no length to an object. There's no length to an object, which is kind of a weird thing. But that's kind of what I want, right? I want to know if it has any properties or doesn't have any properties. So the way that the other terminology that you kind of see with this, oftentimes when we're referring to objects, we refer to those different values as keys, right? So the keys are the properties of that object. Does that make sense? Like a key You have keys and values. So there is one thing we can do. If I say update dot key set, if I remember right, is the name of it. Key set gives me all of the set of keys that are on the object. Now, I want to double check something because I can't remember if it's all lowercase, if it's all uppercase. So I'll kind of show you where to find this. So if I go to MDN, object, key set, okay. Oh, it's not keys, it's just key set, it's just keys. And I'll link this in Discord. So on any object, you can get the keys. So here they've got an object defined with keys of A, B, C. You can see that. And then they're calling object.keys. Object.keys gives me the keys of object 1, and it returns that as A, B, C. Everybody see that? Now it's worth noting how they're calling that. That's actually, they're not calling it on object 1, they're passing object 1 in. So this is actually like a static function. So that's what I want to do here. And so I've kind of got the wrong thing. So object.keys, and I'm going to pass in the update. Now remember that keys returns an array. So it does have a length. So I can say keys.length is greater than 0. So this is kind of a pretty common trick. You have to look at the keys of an object to know if it's an empty object. So this if statement will only go through if there's at least one thing to update. If the object's completely blank, the user hasn't told me to change anything, then I don't need to update any of the tracking information here. All cool? So I want to say, okay, only if there's things to update are we going to proceed with this code. So I want to set two things. Update dot last maybe last updated on would be like a new date. Update dot last updated by, right? So I say, when did we last update it, and who is it updated by? So who it was updated by, I would make that an object. And I want to have some information there about who the user in question is. Okay. So what are the things that we might want to track for who the user that did the update? For what user did the update? Almost everything is in the token, right? Almost everything that's going to be in the token. So if we look back at the login token, we kind of see what's in the token. Back in the login route. We saw that what we put into the token was the ID, the email address, the full name, and the role. That's a reasonable set of things to pass through. So those are all going to be things that are all in the token. And so I just are in the request.auth. So I just want to pull those things out. So here I might say _ID colon request.auth._ID. We're going to say, hey, maybe I want to pull out the email. Although here, no, that's fine. I'll just go with the email with all of that. So request.auth.email. Previously, we've done a ... with some of these things. I'm not doing a ... because there's additional fields, IAT and EXP that we saw yesterday that I don't want to put in there. So that's why I'm being specific about what I copy, because I don't actually want to copy everything, just some things. So request.auth dot full name, and the role is request dot auth dot role. So stuff's copied. So in theory, when I update myself, this will also update those fields on the user object itself. This is also how you kind of get some nested data. Right? As you can see, I can just build up this object and say, hey, what's that last update apply to this object here? Okay. I'm going to do a test on this. And I'm going to kind of walk around and make sure everybody's kind of up to speed. So go back here, hit send. What you should have after all of this, I'm going to go back to users. Did this go through? Oh, I need to actually change the user's name, I think. Oh, apparently my login session timed out. Okay. User updated. What am I missing? No, because I tried to change. Oh, there it is. I don't know why it wasn't showing up previously. It was like, it should be right here. So if you've got everything in place, this is what it should look like. So you should have a last updated on field and a last updated by field. So that way any changes made, we can go back and quickly see, okay, the last person came in and changed to it. Because oftentimes that's relevant as well. The last person who did the thing, in addition to just the full history. Because oftentimes, actually for most queries, this is sufficient. For most queries, it's just sufficient to know just quickly who was the last person to touch it. Okay, so I'm going to go around, take a look, make sure everybody's at the same place. One thing we should probably do, I think 20 minutes is probably too short. So, make sure you save those rather than constantly changing one. Save your requests. So save a login request, save an update request, because that's kind of what's tricky, because you're trying to switch back and forth. So save those requests. Okay. Schema not validated is unfortunate. That's a new one. So the top sectors. Valid body. So schema is
Serena. So it's, that was on. You may be missing, go back to here. No, and with that, there's a sending back to knowledge. It's somewhere in there. Oh, there it is. We didn't actually get to mention. There we go. That's replacing everything in the last copy of five. Yes. So the entire lesson page five is replaced. That went through for you? So, we got to talk with when you register to so emails it.
How much would it cost to I lost, but any RG. Are you in carpool? I'm not really. Some convenience of me getting out of funds and getting around the CS or something. Whatever. What's up, Josh? You ever? You ever?
Oh, Very. Okay, that's. So, your email, you got it. Awesome.
No,
So, so for everybody that's got this working, right, is at where I am. What I want you to do is take the things that we just done, right, where we're denying people that are not logged in. We're logging last updated to the user itself, as well as logging to the edit document. I want you to do those three things in the other update user branch. Does that make sense? So I also want you to do the same things if you're editing somebody else. Okay? So if you got all that, we'll go ahead and proceed. Yeah. Well, that should be throwing your issues. So, biggest suspicion would be this phone titles. And here, address should be checked. Check this file. So, because if that phone is incorrect, so,
Yeah. Lobbies, and some copies. So let's do a open
Try to share it.
Because that should start up.
Okay. So you have a, you're adding stuff to the other route. Okay. Check. Ready? Information there. You've got.
You want to do like this? We want to create that operating on
That's a good question. Yes, you probably I would want to do that. Yes. Well, remember that that's not what I put in there. You look here as a target. When I said target, so you don't want to change that. You want all of your routes to kind of log in the same way. Okay. So if you target means so it is right. Because that's the user targeting your option. Does that make sense? Versus what's in off. Off is already containing the portable. Does that make sense? So that's so in the middle of the post that's okay. Change the phone into something else. So it's set. Okay. So send again. Okay. Yeah, try it again. Okay. So we can do this. So we'll refresh. Oh, I see what it is. I see what it is. It's a do wrap. Yeah, that's what's don't forget to please check it. Make sure you can actually just remember
So I think what you're missing, if you look at the top of who else did that, look at the top of it. So you're gonna have to check. You're just gonna see it. So that's what you're doing. So you're seeing it down here and saying, I think we have you.
Yeah, so we check it was an admin.
So we're gonna start by just saying, like, you did before, if you're logged in, if you're not logged in, stop, right? So we set a 401 code, if you're not logged in, we do the same thing.
Right.
And notice how I did a return there, so we have to route. So I fix it for like updating somebody else, so it doesn't go. I'm gonna put some notes on the board, because I think probably the best thing for me to do at this point is kind of explain some of the theory of fact tracking, and we should run some example code. And so things you want to do in terms of implementing tracking on this project. So we saw in order to update this route, we had to do three things, right? So what were the three things we had to do? For we've got API, user, me. What were the three things we changed? So we checked that the user's logged in. Check the user's logged in. That's number one. Number two is we updated the last updated by fields, or last updated on and last updated by. So we did that, and then we also inserted record into minutes. Okay, so those are the three changes we made, right? And basically the way this works out is we need to do this anywhere we're making changes to the database. We're making changes at all to the database, we should log, we should do this kind of information. So that means that the records, all of the routes in the Pet Adoption Agency that you want to update are as follows. So API /user /me, we've already talked that one. Some of you have already finished the next one, which is user ID. Okay. And the other side then would be on the pets. Okay. So if I look at the routes that I have under pets, kind of collapse some of these so I can look at them. So I have a few different routes over on there. And remember, this one was put. This one was also put. Thinking about the API for users, or for pets,
I've got a route to get the list. I've got a route to get a single pet. Okay. I've got a route to put a new pet. I've got a route to update a pet. And I've got a route to delete a pet. Okay. Right? That's our API for pets, right? To cover all the CRUD bases. Okay. So things to think about. So these are things that we want to update in terms of like working with users and updating users. So we got self-service and we got the admin route. So this stuff over here, it's worth asking who is going to be using this part of the API, right? Who's going to be working with pets, okay? Well, if I start at the top, right, so I've got two routes to get the list of pets and get a single pet. More than likely, we will have customers using those routes. Usually these are public. Sometimes those may be private. Sometimes you may have to be logged in to see that data. In fact, I would argue for if you wanted to do list and get for like users, you should definitely be logged in before you can see anything about the user list, usually. In fact, I would say for your bug tracker, we probably want to secure both of those routes and say that you can't look at any data unless you're logged in. Because even reading the data should really require a login. Some systems that's not a need. So like this system maybe isn't necessary. But if you're doing this with your project, you probably do want to convert those and make sure that at least you have to be logged in. But it's worth noting that means for the two get routes, the only thing you need to do is step one, is just to check that they're logged in. We don't know. Both the get routes don't change any data, so we don't need to do either of those other two things. Does that make sense? So that would be here. We just want to do step one. Actually, I'm going to not do that for here. So we're going to leave those alone. But we want to update these routes, right? So if we're putting a new record, right, we do only want, generally speaking, these three routes are only going to be by, say, employees. So those should definitely require a login. So here we want to say, yes, you want to do 1 and 2 and 3, right? Here you're going to do all those changes. Here you're going to do all those changes. Here you're going to do all those changes, right? Actually, I take that back. I skipped over that really quick. So thinking about that over here, put API at new. So I definitely need to be logged in. That's check one. In terms of updating these fields, right, the two fields you want to update here, you might want to be like created on instead, created on, and created by, right? So we got different fields we want to update there for creation rather than update. Also worth noting for that route, when we insert this record, the edit record, I'd want to say that the op is insert instead. Okay. So that's kind of what's going to be different there, because we're going to have a different operation when we log the edit, and we should have different fields that we're setting. If we're going through the update, updating a pet, same really as updating the user. We want to do the same exact logic. in terms of deleting a pet, I still want to check that the user is logged in. Does it make sense to update the document if we're deleting it? Not really, because it's going to be gone, right? So we don't need to do any sort of update, right? So for that one, we're going to skip step 2. We're deleting it. There's not really any value to updating it because it's going to be gone. But we still want to record it as far as edits have gone. The difference being there, I would just set the auth to delete. Cool. So given those kind of notes, what I want you to do is kind of take what we've kind of just done, and I want you to do the pet API, make those changes. I'll be by to take a look, and we can kind of give everybody a chance to kind of do those things and get some practice with it. Because everybody's kind of running at a different pace. So, and we'll do that. Once we're done with that, we'll come back and talk about number 3.
On our edits, back to your collection, for the update field,
Yep.
we delete, which is the update field, right? Like anything.
They wouldn't have anything. Yeah, you just not include it. There's no update.
Gotcha.
So, yeah. So,
And then I guess for insert, you want to have the whole, that whole document.
yep. So that would be like the whole document.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. So that's what we'll do for a bit here. Kind of go through and update your APIs, and then we'll kind of come back and do the next thing after people have a chance to kind of get through that. Well, series is a modified count, but it did update the user. So. Interesting note is that you don't have a role for that. So, because you didn't have a role at the beginning of the user. So what you want to do is add another document here. Add the role. And set it to custom. And so now log in again. Go back here, do another log in. Now your token should be on. Okay. So try to update the user. So you just didn't have a role in, so change elements in that role. Okay. So do the next one. So you kind of see we've got 4 more routes here. That looks like seconds. So off becomes off jail cell.
So it says, it says it can't be filed after of, it shows that the cookie, those cookies. Yeah, it probably is. Look at those. So there's that. Good practice. You're missing all the new code. Now you're just back up to where you were. So. So you look under the well, and you can also, there's some changes that we made to this statement. So we put in check it, so you can only do this if you're logged in. So you say, so make sure that that's there. So you only do it if you're logged in. And update these details. And that was blocked because it's updated. The last updated on the flag. And also say manage document. Yes. That's the and incorporate those two parts into the idea. You will do that on which part loss okay? Go for it. So then, running
sweet.
So what are you trying to enter, what are you trying to escape? What are you trying to have in there?
I want this to be in everything.
Oh, slash.
Word slash, it's interpreting the
Yeah. So one thing, go back to your code. This should just be single quotes, because you've got no templates. And so no replacements. Second one, I don't think you can. Because that push in deciding if it's a link, which is actually incorrect.
and it's just pretty raw.
Yeah. It's coming through correctly, that's a problem, that's a button pushing it should be. That's just a problem pushing it. So you have to restart it, something. Oh, not this one. Again, just don't have this one here. So we should try to do something. Now we just lost them. So let's go back and show the results. And but this is bypassing. So this should be renamed as Unauthorized rule. Unauthorized rule is not being set. So why is that? I'll set it here. Let's do this. So then let's explicitly claim so require so well dot end is going to be dot end. So whatever is happening, this should dot end. And I think so I think you have that. Okay. So it's not complaining. And I think if we go back to here.
So whatever whatever's going on, basically, we're just really. I don't know why, but it's still. So that's fine. We want to get back to the word that the changes on there. Okay, so these couple stuff. So it's just a matter of so we will pull a question yeah, you can get that one. So what kind of I would leave it out of the database. Yeah. So I would change this to just be considered that. That's one of the things I got back and forth. I would just roll back to just right. There's one thing you can do by your place. Yeah. But obviously, I don't want to have the database doing anything off. Yeah. So you kind of want to be consistent. Yeah. So that's where it's like, well, I'd rather have the off happen here and have an out happen here. So okay. It's fine. It was in the other side of things. I mean, ideally, I kind of want to eliminate it. What I leaned for was I don't want to make a mistake and leave something out in the edits. It's more important than do that. So yeah, that's so that is one of the yeah here you can see I left it out because I was supposed to let's even say some things versus here versus here and edit it and say let's just and that was just being easier. What I would actually do if you're going to do the other way around and say let's not do anything other than actually, I guess all you do in group there is the idea. I'm saying it's like, well, maybe we can about other food. Actually, you could go by the yeah, go for it. Yeah, yeah, I do not see this would be one phone is fine. Or actually, I would go this way. That's inconsistent. Yeah, that's fine. I was thinking, well, probably when people do that, but actually the idea is that there's users, so I really need to do that or not. I do this or not. Yeah, that's fine. Actually, keep the role. You keep the role. You definitely want to keep the role. If you want to solve that, you should do it. It's now did some do it and didn't have that would be and to register?
Yeah.
You use your passport to log into the registrar account.
Sometimes, it's not kind of a breach, I would say, you want them to be able to do certain things while having an account.
But if I can't register without an account, how do you function in other access?
You have to have a button for it.
So I said, don't update the registration, just update the, don't update the registration. Registration. The assumption is that anonymous user is a registrar.
Yeah, for
So that's the so pull this up.
my question for this one, I think,
From the office, right? Remember this memo that we had yesterday? Yeah, that's what we care. Yeah, so you're not gonna track it on the registration. I guess you could. Yeah, so get rid of the off side. Because it's not, it's by yourself. Off doesn't make sense. But keep that as updated. Because then we call it update.
you call it update, I can,
Look at the one you did.
I don't know, I've been thinking in mind, whenever I call it for it,
Okay.
we also have, call,
That's all.
yeah, I wouldn't, really want to start with one.
Yeah, so in those cases, the register doesn't get lost. It's this. And you want to. Okay. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah, the register route generally has some. Not always, because usually, if it's not registered route, then it has to go. That's what we do.
I was thinking that it sounded like you wouldn't let anybody just come to the page and make an account for a database.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Then, you're restricting the methods to certain users, and it's not anybody's able to just be like Kansas.
Yeah, and that's a good thing.
Which is what I was thinking there. I was thinking that issue trackers, but we're in text, we're in text.
Yeah, so we could just assume that, like, we're assuming you can want to have a password. So, same password. Okay. So, what I would do is go to the tool that we had mocked up yesterday. Yeah, run that again to see what it's like. Control C. So no tools slash password. That will run. So you see there's two passwords, but now use that to put in the database. And that should get your password. So you know because it might be something else. We have to have password features. We kind of have to do it. Still doesn't like it. check your code. We're gonna get your code. User login. So, login. Anything about password, there's the user not password. Okay, this is the question. The comparison is telling you it's not, that's not. Try to register your name. So you try to I know why it is. The reason is you have that in, part of the reason is you have that in lowercase, and I think probably if you're looking at the user, it's pretty sensitive. So I would recommend doing a login out, doing some debugging to see what's happening. Okay. So user password, debug login password, user password, and see if there are restrictions. Maybe there's something else.
I noticed that I'm kind of doing last name twice.
Yeah.
One thing here.
I would get rid of it from the database module. Same way with I would move that logic over back into the file. You look at all of this stuff out. Even if early races combine with the dot, and we're saying spread it out. And so part of that would be what's called. Yeah, it's almost the same. It's almost the same. Like, I can get this, but you guys do this. Go to this one. Now, so go ahead and put some. save this. We have saved it. Try to log it. There you go. So you got here, I think up top, you've got so I have to add it into the list. So sure, that's. Go back to so so it should have a so you go in there. Well, that's just what's in the book. That's what's in the book. Yeah, save it. It's a here, it says, okay, you can actually change it. So this is what this is. Oh, I see. What do we want to do? It's two arguments. That means something. Or you could just do it on the chat. So just take a look and see. Understood the three sections correctly, we should look out track, tap, graded, ungraded, something. So, yeah, we got. Because you can't change in data. No, just at the moment, we're going to understand. That's a topic for next week. So, yeah. Where's the reference area?
Yeah, because I was trying to figure it out, so when I do it, I'm just gonna do it. So I just use that and just
Yeah, I'll show you. So, okay. Right here. So, yeah, you don't have that idea. You don't have a area. Yeah. The other way to do this is, it's the value that happens, this variable. What I would do is, I would just say const related. It's equal to 1. Okay. And then rather than create another ID here, and rather than create another ID, I would say, events.
Yes.
Put 3 versus around the first one. So I'll take everything that's on the first line, put it out, and you can also add so it basically does what you have done already. And that's kind of what the registry is. You say, hey, you want to register.
And then you also want to drag along to your
No.
Oh, you don't.
We can only be on login. Because that creates a route where you can /back/login.
And so what is the author that
So it's telling me the auth doesn't count, but the request is not kind of offered. We have it.
Oh, but why does it go on this side? So
But it still doesn't know what's yeah, we just don't find it out for whatever reason.
Yes.
Here, that uses here.
So they all do it.
Well, this one's showing this request and versus this one's showing this request is I don't know what the app is. This is that
Yes.
This is showing that's why it's here. And then this one's exactly.
That's good. As long as it works.
It's a case of we're modifying the request, so the request instead of these additional numbers. Language, she was saying checking if the roles okay, that's a reasonable thing to do. I didn't actually do that, but that is a reasonable thing to do. There's 2 things going on. First of all, you're only doing this check if they're not on there. Oh. Right. So you can't check if they're on there if they're all able to show them they're not on there. So that can't be nested inside. That's yeah, so they have to be outside of it. let's fix that. Yeah, can't do this. The other thing in there, one variable over there, you should know, because I want to stop thinking about that. Yes, I would actually do that. That one I said return, that whole actually difference. Oh, it's the same difference, but we put color on that. So, that one makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So you have to say stop, because otherwise it keeps running the rest of the drive. And it really has an effect. So, okay, so keep doing, starting along, so we can stop. This you know you can actually
Yeah, that makes sense.
that's something that I talk about. I didn't explicitly say that yet. But that's more, this is more something that we need to talk about next week.
Oh,
But that's fine. If you can put it in there, that's kind of it.
okay.
Cool.
So I'm glad you did upgrade this. Based on.
So first the user that we updated,
So it's upgrade this one.
so what's our first user there? And I did what we did. Should be targeted. Targeted. Search and search. So you're still editing yourself. Right? So the part of this route is actually how you edit someone else. Not just yourself. And that means that these two are first going to be different. So I can say in here, I can go back to user. Now you're logged into this one, right? But I don't think that's what they're like something else. Alright, I'm going to take this user ID, copy that. And then I'm going to go over here and put down stat. Because that's where the route is. So, which, that's the second. And so we check the big picture. Now, not that one. Now, you get how it's sent, you're still going to get the same error because your token still says that you're a customer. So you have to log in. Oh. That's not possible. Oh. So the chief's business as this and the tendency should see the better than the tendency to do it wrong. That's the beauty of the target. Notice how the project is grayed out. If you want the project is grayed out.
Yeah, I was trying to get rid of the columns, because show all the fields. Figure it out.
We usually would bring that information back. Sometimes you might put it down that necessarily, whereas you might open that.
Yeah, I forgot we did it. It was confusing.
That's fine. But the better way to do it might even just be more explicit about what. Like I would still want to project, but maybe we just do.
All just it's not all fields. You have to list them all, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
So project is kind of like, all these things. It's helpful because it kind of gives a predictability to other applications that might be using it. So they know this is only the data that I return. Because otherwise it's like, it's change.
You have one of most of the users that should do that.
So we don't. We're not going to touch them. So remember the registration, just wait for basically so when you register as a customer, you don't have to have stuff.
So for our other question, for our issue,
That's a good question. That's a good question. Is what the initial role should be. I think the safest thing to assume would be the one assumption you could make is to assume that new users are developers. But another assumption you could make is to say, well, they don't initially have a. That would be the secure thing to say, hey, anybody can create an account, so it's easier for people to get signed up. Because oftentimes you want somebody to register and then promote them to get everyone. So I might say to register them, but don't say no initial.
Yeah, I was just kind of thinking about whether you've got just employees working on this, or there's employees and there's also requirements there.
That's a good, that's a good question. Something like that. When you think about the support tickets or something, well, your customers can actually fill in stuff, and it's not making for you to register. said this, most setups, you can just register a customer account, start support tickets.
Yeah.
So you start it kind of minimal permissions.
Because I imagine if it was just employees, you almost won't have to let someone create an account unless it's created by
Which is,
Yeah, no, just kind
I
of
think, I would lean on the side of anybody can register an account, but you don't start with it. So you basically can't do it. You can register an account, but you can update your profile.
Yeah, gotcha.
That's kind of the thing. You can't do anything else, like you can't work with bugs,
Okay.
probably.
Yeah, no, I just kind of figured that.
Move on to the password and password. Login password. Login password. So it's so the portion of that would indicate the user is so it's not finding a user. And look at the user right now. Now, go back. Go back. So open call. And go back to user right. Just because otherwise some things can happen. And that's where we can that helps context. Okay. So it's not getting stopped by so you can pull up all the other screen and the videos. And see if they match what it. So it seems to be I don't think it's I think it's stopping. Yes. Yeah, that's fine. So you go back to the you got that? Great. Okay. So try it out yourself. Turn out the restaurants, so, about 5 minutes. Two users. Just like this part, we definitely charge it like database doing, and then we want to just do the auth stuff. But that's fine. Well, we want just the IDs. Right, because you have to get that. So you need to send an FID colon before this. You know, so FID colon, so it goes with. It's like, that's a value. I can put that in there, but what is the name of it? So you've got the key amount. Yep, that was for sure. You can check. I think I'm gonna resume. So I'm gonna, I think, talk a little bit about the off-middleware stuff for 3:30. I'm gonna take the last hour and talk a little bit about enhancing off-middleware. Done, then just go ahead and start with this. It's basically gonna be the same stuff. Cool. So it kind of covers some cool. So we're in off-middleware, all the kind of things. Let's hang on here for this.
You kind of have a pointer to where to go.
Okay, yeah, so that route's connected to like the nature of that. Yeah, I don't, yeah, that's what I would expect to see. I would definitely recommend testing. There are some gotchas there. Awesome. Okay. Yeah, so it's gonna be very simple, right? So remember what did we change, right? What did we change here that kind of supports it gives us, added some stuff to say, you have to go on it. We're making some changes here. This person, and then this person. So there's three things. So it's three things. You have to log in, and log the last week. Well, it wouldn't be that. So we wouldn't do that because the offset is that they have to be different. So this stuff is really won't be done. So the reason we're doing this is when we're registering an account, we want you to need to be logged in. So this is so you're logged into the account, right? We can't log in. Okay? They don't have apps. Right? They don't have those. So they're not logging in, so you're not doing it. So if you go back to that James, right? Yeah. Okay. So far so good, but needs to be. I would recommend doing something. You need to kind of set up this register route yesterday. You might need to have some features with you. See how it does have to do it. You add it into the I would say it's okay, right? So here's what I have. You will have don't trust your database code, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
They check your database code, because you see what I said, right now, that's like, oh, what's the database?
Yeah.
It's only if you like code. It's the same part.
Yeah.
So, I'm guessing that's the case.
I went to do
That's I don't know why it's something I look for.
you got like the last one.
It's something I look for, I guess, because I'm like, I just don't have to see this to be
Optimistic. Thank you.
I think it probably says something about the mistakes I've made myself. The mistakes that I make myself are usually the quickest ones.
But it's like an easy thing to miss, you know, so.
Yeah. You kind of understand what it's all about. Right? You need some more security. Right? Maybe it's a login. Yeah, because the that's gone. It's gone. So where's your so you check in the app and log in. Yeah, I mean that's how they do it. You're like, how do you get out of this? Do you do it?
Is there a selection for one monster?
So kind of makes sense. Really, there's a lot. You know how to shuffle? Yeah, makes sense. Just a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I have played one for a year. Which was all created in people.
You're doing this before you actually do it. Why is that running on the paper or anything? You haven't saved it. Start it. It's good to know when I'm working with that.
That's good. used to, definitely, yeah, okay. So something we're doing in the daily where it is doing.
Because we put that in first, and so you would like to put that in too.
Yeah, so I'm asking here, it's doing that for the
I had it,
and this is where I can change.
yeah.
So it's still doing it, still doing it, fine, but it's taking it from certain, or from, users or pet instead of data set.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm going to start back up here in about 2 minutes. Okay.
If I can have your attention up front. I took a snap of kind of what's on the board, so that's on Discord, so you can kind of work on that from home if you haven't finished that today. But I do kind of need to finish up the last piece of the theory that we didn't get to, so this is kind of the last part of the handout. We kind of paused on this on, I think, Monday, and we kind of need to finish out those last few pages to kind of talk about a few things. Okay? This is not something I want you to necessarily code along with. We're going to focus on the theory, so pull on the handout, put your code aside for a minute. The other side of things is just the little code that I want to show you is all going to go into the auth middleware. It's actually really easy to fat finger some stuff, so I don't really want you coding along with this. I'll give you the finished thing when we're done, so you can kind of look over it. But it's a really easy thing to make some mistakes and kind of get some issues in there. So I want to kind of have a look at it after we're finished with it. So in HTTP, we've kind of talked about some of the headers that are available out there. Like we've talked about, hey, we can set cookies. That actually there's a set cookie header that accomplishes that. Also in HTTP, another way to deal with authentication is there's actually an authorization header. The authorization header is specifically designed for dealing with logins, actually. It's a way to pass your credentials, whether that be your username and password or your token. And actually, commonly we use that with a lot of front-end applications, especially if you're dealing with React. So cookies are one way to deal with that, and they're kind of a convenient way to deal with it. But we'll want to set up our application so that they can handle this authorization header. Make sense? The authorization header, basically we use it after the login. So you use register a login to create an account, and then from there we'll use the token. Basically what we'll do is we'll use the token, pass it through as this authorization header. Okay, so let's talk about what this is. So JSON Web Tokens are often stored and passed around in cookies. Another way we can pass that around is using this authorization header. The authorization header contains the credentials that are used to authenticate a user agent with a server, and the header has this format. Okay, so when you receive the header, it will be authorization is the name of the header, not authentication, but authorization. And it has two things, type and credentials. Type and credentials, those are separated by a space. It's worth noting that this is a header you actually have to generally parse in your own code. So you have to recognize that there's two pieces and there's a space, and we actually do have to check for that and deal with the specific formatting. Because when we read the authorization header, we'll be getting the whole thing, including the type and the credentials. So one of the things we have to do is break that apart. So the type in there says what kind of scheme, how are we doing the credentials? How is the second part to be used? Okay.
So it kind of tells you the protocol or way you're using for credential management. There are actually a bunch of different options out there, but I'm only going to focus on two, which basically covers 99% of most websites. Okay. So in terms of the two types that you see mostly is basic and bearer. Basic and bearer. So basic is the most simpler version, and basically means when the way that you're going to receive the credentials is going to be username, password. Okay, so that's what's actually being passed. That's what you're going to see as the credential, is username, password. Sort of, because they're also base64 encoded. So remember how your token was base64 encoded? Same story. We base64 encode the username and password there. If you send back a 401 status to the client, that's where you see this, and that's where it will return back with the authorization header of basic. So if you're going to handle that, you actually kind of have to handle that just like we did on the login route. Does that make sense? You have to say the username and password, the email and password, run them through the database, check if there's a user with that, and then respond with the handle basic auth. I'm not really worried about handling basic auth too much. It's a good kind of experiment and play around with. We won't actually end up using it in the final application, so that's not something we have to, say, implement, but it's a good thing to kind of understand how it works, or at least that it's out there. Okay. The other kind of auth there, the other type that's going to show up here is something called bearer. Bearer just says the next thing is a token. Simple as that. So you see bearer and then token. And so then you can use whatever token scheme you want. In fact, I think the OAuth was kind of the one that originally standardized this. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a JWT token. It can be any kind of token. But that's the main one we use. Is usually we're going to say, hey, there's bearer is the first word, and then there's a JWT token after that. And so that's often how we're going to receive it from our React applications or Angular or whatever it may be. Or even maybe from an Android app. The Android app's probably going to usually going to send credentials this way as an authorization bearer. Okay? So this is one of the more common ways that you're going to see other applications connected. So basic authorization looks like this. Bearer token, we're going to see the bearer word and the token. So let's look at how we handle some of these things. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Okay. Everybody kind of see the code on screen? So in terms of working with this, and these are things that we would, if we wanted to handle these different authentication limits, this is all stuff we would add to that auth middleware. Does that make sense? So like right now, all we've done is put code in there to kind of handle the authentication with cookies. Okay? So here I want to talk about, well, how do we authenticate using an auth header? Okay. Well, things that we need to do, we can kind of see some code example here. So I can get a header from Express. You can get any of the request headers by calling get header and then the name of the header. So this will return whatever content is in the auth header specifically after that first colon. So remember, it's authorization colon and then the type and credentials. So bring back all that string that's after. Okay. We can check if that's there, if there is an auth header, because oftentimes there may not be one. If there's no authorization header, then we're not doing anything here with it. You do have to check for that, otherwise your application will crash for 90% of your users. So you do have to check for that. From there, remember we said these were separated by spaces. Okay. Well, there's more than one way to split things up, right, when you're dealing with spaces. And the easiest method to know about is in JavaScript, there's a method called split. And split will let you split a string based on a particular placeholder. So here I'm saying let's split the string up based on space. So this will then give me an array of strings for what was separated by spaces. So like the first string that comes back will be the type. The second thing that comes back will be the credentials. Does that make sense?
There are some gotchas here. This code, just to be clear, this is not perfect. There are some bugs. So here I am limiting it to 2. I'm saying I only care about the first 2 things. If there's more things or more spaces, I don't care. Also in here, if I have a case where there's 2 spaces between the type and the credentials, this does not handle that, just so we're clear. Because when you do a split, the split would do 3 strings that way. If there were 2 spaces, it would give you the type, and then an empty string, and then the credentials would actually be in the 3rd element. So dealing with things where there might be variable spaces in between the type and the credentials becomes a little bit harder, because you usually have to get into regular expressions, or you have to do like a find index kind of thing. So I'm not accounting for that here. This is kind of the simple version, assuming they do the same thing and just put 1 space in between. Okay, so it's kind of the simple version. I break this out. Now, you'll notice I'm doing something new here. Auth type, auth token. So there's a few new concepts in this code. This is actually what we call array destructuring. So I'm split returns an array, ideally of 2 things, right? And then I'm saving it into these variables auth type and auth token. So to kind of illustrate what's happening here, if I have, illustrate what's happening here. If I have const xy equal to 3, 4, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so let's have an array over there containing elements 3, 4, and 5. X at this point would become 3 because it's the first element. Y would become 4. The 5 would be discarded. That kind of makes sense? It's actually very similar to object destructuring. It's kind of the same analog. So for instance, with object destructuring, it looked like const curly brace xy is equal to so if I had an object with the properties x, y, and z, this would destructure and pull out x and y. With the array, it's just kind of brackets, and I pull out them from the beginning to the end. It's a very helpful shorthand for a lot of things. Cool? Especially split here. So that's kind of what's happening. So auth token is going to be auth type is going to be the first piece of that, and auth token is going to be the second piece of that. Cool? Questions? Does that explain what's going on there? Split and the array destructuring, and 2 very useful tools. If I was going to write this out longhand, this might look something like take the write this off longhand. I might say, okay, the header would be bearer. That's what we're getting as the header and token. Header space token. So if I split it, so doing header dot split, and split it on spaces, that would give me
that would give me here. This would be an array. The first index would contain mirror. The second thing here is token. And so I'm kind of shorthanding this by saying, okay, const type is equal to split 0 and const token is equal to split. I'm just writing that in one line instead of 3. So that's what's happening. So the next thing I go to do is I say that the type, okay, I only want to check, I only want to do anything if the type is basic. So here I'm handing basic off. So if it's basic and there is a token, there's a second part to this, then I can proceed. Otherwise, we don't do anything because these are having to give us all the right things and it's not basic auth. So it's some other kind of authentication, right? So there's a lot of error checking that has to go in if you're going to check those authorization. Okay. From there, we need to then decode the base64. Okay. So the way this comes in with basic auth, and maybe I should, let me pull this code in and kind of play around with it in the middleware. So I'm going to take this in a second. Again, no need to code along with this. I'm just demonstrating some things. Okay, so I'm going to bring this code in, and I'm going to go down to here and do a debug. Actually, I do a debug at the top. Debug auth header. Okay. So if I try to do Postman, maybe I just go to pet and let's just say let's list the pets. So I hit send. Okay. Oh, request.getHeader is not a function. Well, that's not promising. Okay, I think they've changed this. That code might be wrong. Yep, there. Yeah, so that's, I think, what I need to have there. So you'll notice initially there's nothing there. Initially there's no header. In Postman, if I want to try to actually send this header, the place that you go to is under authorization. Collapse this. Okay. Settings. Oh no. Oh no, there it is. So there's an authorization tab on the request, and you'll notice there's a bunch of options in there, right? So the two that I'm talking about is really just basic auth from here and the bearer token auth from there. So if we go to basic auth, you'll see that there's two fields. Okay, so there's a field for the username and there's a field for the password. So if I put in what I had for the login, I think it was paul.smith@example.com, and this was test user. If I hit send, Still no header. What is going on here? What did I do wrong? So going back here. Apparently I'm missing something. So something about my code's not right. Because it's not reading the header. So request headers send. There we go. Oh, duh. Okay. So when it comes in, it's coming in as lowercase instead of coming in as uppercase. And my code didn't assume that there was an uppercase A in there. And so that's where my problem lies. And so what's up here should be request dot headers authorization. So that was actually wrong on there. It looks like it lost my place. Go figure. So that should be this, and that should be that. Okay. Okay. There's what I'm trying to get to. Back to it. Okay. So I passed in a username and password, and I came back in here, and I kind of look at what's happening. So buffer is okay. I may have to play around with that. So there are some errors in here that I maybe should account for. Okay. So if we read it through, right? So we've got a basic. There's the header, right? So here's the header as we're receiving, right? So this is what we're receiving as the username and password. This is what the basics are. Oftentimes, if you're looking at a string, you see these equals at the end. That's a good signature that is probably base64 encoded because that's actually spacing. If it's not a certain length, then it adds equals to the end spacing as a padding. So there's that. What I want to really look at, though, is what happens when I get all the way down here to the last part. So when I get down here and I log the username and I log the password, so I want to keep the log I had up above. Debug, username, password, because that's the part that I'm trying to get down to. So I send it here, I see it here, there they are. Okay, so that's kind of what's encoded into here. So I say let's grab the two pieces. Okay, under that token, because it's base64 encoded, I have to base64 decode it. So the way in Node that we do those kind of things is we take we create a buffer. That's called a buffer. We pass in the auth token, which is that raw string. We know that it's already base64 encoded. We have to tell it that it is base64 encoded, and that's not already asking. It then creates a buffer. So a buffer, you can think about it as this way is kind of an array of bytes. So the base64 encoding is kind of a way to represent an array of bytes as characters. Make sense? So we can pass it around where we just allow strings and things like that. Like in a database, you might want to save it as a string. So different places like that. So Then we take the buffer, we call toString, turn it back to ASCII, so that turns it back to what it originally was, which was ASCII. Cool? So that's how we switch it over. We say it starts as base, goes over to ASCII. Okay. Decoded, I have to go back and do a split again. So I say decoded.split, because there's a little colon between the two. So I split those and then do an array of structure again. It's part of why I went ahead and did this, is because we're going to do this more than once. So I said, let's split it. There's a new cross name. Good, right? And so then at that point, if we wanted to say, use that, you do the same thing where you would say, okay, let's go to the database. Let's check that that user exists. And if that user exists, issue a new token and a new cookie and go on to do the next thing. Does that make sense? So it would be kind of the same stuff that we had in our login mod. Okay, just so you know about how to implement that. In reality, what I want is more to kind of deal with the bearer token, which is kind of a similar sort of problem. So dealing with the bearer token starts with the same way, but it ends a little bit differently. So I start by grabbing the header again from the authorization, header. I want to then check if it's there. I'm going to break it out again, type and token, split it. I'm going to check this time that it's bearer and not basic, and that there's a token there. At that point, then, you can kind of do what we did with cookies. We say, hey, let's try to verify it. Let's try to verify that this token is good using the secret. If it's all good, we get back to payload. We'll save it here. So there's a token. So which is kind of similar, right, to how we dealt with the cookie, which was just to kind of pull out of request of cookies to auth token, and then parse it here. So if there is a cookie, we'll try to parse it, otherwise it's invalid. That kind of makes sense? So there's different ways that you can receive it. It's just that that requires a bit more text processing to do with the authorization. That all makes sense? So oftentimes when we're building up these applications, we may want to build up an application, build up an auth middleware that can handle both the, you're looking at that. It's often helpful for us to build up a middleware that can handle both the auth header, right, basic authentication, bearer token, and the cookie. We usually support all three of those within the single authentication middleware, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So that because sometimes you just a lot of cookies, stuff like that.
Yeah, or you're doing cross-domain stuff, which is what we're actually going to be doing is we have the basically you have the backend on this website, is this on this server, and then on another server you have the front end. And so they're two different domain names, but cookies really generally only go with one domain. Does that make sense? So we can't necessarily use a cookie. We have to use the authorization header to do across domains. Does that help answer that? So, and that's commonly if you're using a lot of other APIs that exist. Let's say you're using Facebook or Twitter, you're generally going to be sending this authorization header to them. So that's how we would implement that. So what I want to show is kind of how do we put these things together. We talked about the status codes. So what I wanted to show is how to build up a larger one. Now I do have to fix the code here because I read the header out wrong. So this should be headers. That's where this changes. Okay. So that's where this would be different. So oftentimes if I wanted to kind of combine this all together, I might say, hey, let's try to read the header and the cookie. We'll say if the header's there, then I want to do kind of processing that way. Or there's a cookie, so you can kind of go either way. So you can go, hey, here's if there's header, do this. if there's a cookie, do this. Either way, we go off to the next middle. So I want to kind of show how to put these things together and play around with that. But this is kind of what we're going to. So here, if you're trying to mark up the code, I will give you a copy of this file when we're done with it. Okay, a few things to mark because I saw a few people do this. I'm going to actually walk back to the code that we had originally. A few things that I saw, one thing that I saw at least a few people do when they put the try catch, we put the try catch further out like so. Which this doesn't work. Okay, I'm trying to fix it real quick, but I wanted to kind of elaborate and think about why this particular thing doesn't work, so that everybody kind of understands what's going on. So when we have the outer function, right? When we have this outer function, this, remember, is a factor. This is the thing that actually constructs the. This is the thing that actually constructs the middleware itself, right? It's the factory. This factory actually gets called as soon as the application starts. We call this function in the very minute we actually install it. In fact, if we go look at server.js, that outer function gets called right here. That gets called right here, and once only. So anything we put in the outer function happens once at the beginning, never again. Does that make sense? So if I look at how this is here, this try catch, notice this try catch is in the outer function. It's catching errors in the outer function, and then trying to call next, which at that point doesn't exist, right? So that's not what we want to do. So I'm going to revert and go back and look at what's going on here, because the way that everything's indented is pretty important. So in here, we say, let's construct a function. And you'll notice it's in terms of like auth, at least the way I have this structured literally, auth just literally returns this function. That's literally all it does, right? The rest of the code is actually inside of that function. That function runs later. That's our actual middle. So all the code that's inside of those lines here, this code is code that's running later. The code outside of that would be running now at the beginning. Everybody clear with that? So, and oftentimes that's helpful because I may want to run some code at the beginning and some code later. Okay, I kind of understand that. But generally speaking, all your errors, most of your errors will happen at runtime. Most of your errors are going to happen when the user is actually doing things, which is why we've got this code in here, right? So all of that code is running when the request is actually. Cool? Make sense? There's actually two functions happening here. And we're really dealing with the world of synchronous code because we have code that's run now and code that's run later, but they're right next to each other. You see that? So we're talking about like the code doesn't necessarily run from top to bottom. Cool? It's not run line, 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 line. Okay, so things we want to do. Things we want to do. I'm going to kind of move some things around and try to get back to kind of where we were in the code example. So one thing I know is this secret here. I actually know that secret isn't going to change, right? I know that secret once we start the application isn't going to change. So I can actually take that secret and move it up safely, right? I'd actually move it all the way up there because it's not going to change. Everybody good with that? Other things I might want to do, let's take the cookie And I might want to, I'm going to leave that there actually. No, I will move that up. So I might want to move this up. Say, hey, let's grab the cookie. We also want to grab that token or the header, because it may be either way. So I start by, let's grab both the header and the cookie, because it could be the information that I need could be on either side. I then go in to say, hey, we're going to do something if there's the header there, blah. Otherwise, if there's a cookie. So at least in this scheme, I'm only considering the header. I'm only considering the cookie if the header is present. So I'm just saying the header strictly, the header takes over. If you pass me header, I'm going to ignore it, which is kind of okay, right? Typically, we expect users to send it in one way, and so it actually makes more sense to only allow one way or the other. And that's where this code in here would fit in. Is kind of pull in the header, decode it, etc. So that's where the part that we were looking at earlier. So bring in that. Boop, 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 boop. Versus we're seeing, what was the other way? We're saying if there's a cookie, then try to parse it there. So that's where I kind of want to go, is over to this method. I think I'm actually going to chop the first part off. So if I have my middleware set up this way, they can either pass the token as authorization, or I can pass it as well. So, boop, boop, boop. Back here. Let's pick basic. Let's pick bear, right? You see bear allows you to enter something in. I think I have something in there from previously. Debug error is not defined. So this should be just debug. So, oop. Invalid token. I need to get a nice valid token. So if I go to my login, send, there's my token. And I think I need to go to another route. So update me auth bearer. There. Okay, there it went through. So I can go either way. And so that's kind of one of those enhancements that we do. You know, that's where you can find it, is under auth. You go to bearer token, you can put in type in your pass it that way. So you can either go as a cookie, you can go as authorization. And we oftentimes test our, if you're dealing with somebody else's API, that's pretty common. Questions? So I've made some changes kind of to this middleware. And that's kind of the finished version of that. It's either a bearer token or questions? That's kind of how you do it. And that's how, and you saw how can I kind of send some stuff through push window too.
So in the header,
Yes.
if the password, the username and password always connected,
What do you mean? Is it in the what in the header is the what?
is the username and password always there?
So notice that there's a bunch of ways to send it. So if you look at the type here, that type drop down. So if you send it as basic auth, it's going to kind of send it as that username password. But if I send it as bearer token, that's just here's a token. Right? Here's a token that you've given me previously. Go use that. So that's often the way we authenticate. Yeah.
Would bearer be like more secure than basic?
In some sense, yes, mostly because you're using a bearer. I mean, mostly because you're using a token. And the token is, in general, yes, going to be more secure. The other side of things is this is also a lot cheaper going through bearer token versus basic auth, because every time you hit with basic auth, you have to go check the username and password and see if it's right. That requires a database strip to do basic auth every time. Versus bearer token, we've already done all the database work, all the hard work. We need to say, oh, is the token valid? Good, I don't need to go to the database again. Does that make sense? So I do actually prefer to do bearer, but that requires you to kind of have that front end already. You can't really do bearer if you don't have a front end already. Basic you can use just through the browser because it does give you that username and password. This is kind of a weird thing.
So will those have the same expiration dates?
So, yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. So, if I'm dealing with those, as far as my token expires, right? This is I said the token expires after X so long, right? So actually that, if I'm passing it as a bearer token, it's going to be good until the token expires, right? I can keep using the token. So if I'm doing it that way, I'm kind of relying on the front end to figure out how to get or how to expire the token sooner, usually, right? So I'm kind of relying on the front end to do that. Versus if I set a cookie, well, yeah, then that automatically is deleted after a certain amount of time. So if I'm doing it that way, it would have no effect. And that's part of the distinction there. Part of the reason sometimes I just usually set them to the same thing. It just kind of avoids some of that complexity. Another thing you may want to do sometimes, we can add to the auth token itself as well. We can also say if the token is potentially going to expire, we could potentially issue a new token. It's actually another possibility that we can do in here, namely, or issue another cookie specifically. So things we could do, we could say, well, every time, if I get down here, if request.auth, if we got down here and there is a valid thing, actually, I only need to do this if there's a cookie. If the cookie is valid, we might go to res cookie. I might want to reset the cookie because we kind of talked about refreshing, extending the code. That would be where this would be. So it's like, okay, you gave me a valid cookie. Maybe we want to extend that cookie. So I could say auth token like we did before. I'd need to generate a new token. Or actually, no, I don't need to generate a new token. I can just send back the same one, auth token. And we just say, hey, what's the max age of that token? So kind of like we issued it previously, let me go back to the user route. This is kind of the part that's interesting. If I went back to here, no, yep, I want this cookie options. And if I added that in, that would extend the cookie for another 20 minutes. So if I add this code in, every time you give me it, not every time you do something, now it's extended for 20 minutes because I make you. So we can do things like that, right? We can incorporate things to extend the life of the cookie here, or I could also incorporate code in here to extend the life of the token itself too. If that makes any sense. Questions? That's usually one part of this too. I'm going to add that in here. Okay, that's kind of all I wanted to point out, is to kind of give you some more things that usually look at here. This code obviously can get more and more complex. The good news is, largely in part, you can reuse it. Large in part, most websites kind of have the same authentication system at this point, because the previous system made a token, and then it's just like, okay, you already have the token. We're good. So a lot of this code is pretty reusable. So one of the things I'm going to do then is I will commit this to GitHub. And I'm going to push this up. This is kind of a weird part. I didn't know where to fit this in, because it's like, do we talk about this now? Do we talk about this later? Because one thing we'll obviously need is just where and when do we talk about it. So I'm going to go to here, Reveal in File Explorer, and toss that in. So I tossed my finished kind of copy of this up if you want to take a look at it on Discord. I'm also going to update this to incorporate that code. So incorporating the refresh code. Okay. So that's over there. Good. Okay. I don't need to do some formatting. Okay. So that's kind of where we're going to land for today. If you haven't finished with all those updates, definitely continue to do that and do that tonight. And hopefully tomorrow, you guys can get basically started on that one, and I'll have all that stuff ready to go. Cool. One reminder on perusal, there is a reading assignment. That's the same stuff that we've looked at here in my kind of lecture outline. I tossed it up on perusal. Just remember to take a look at that, ask any questions that you have. That reading assignment is kind of due on Friday. I pushed it out, so you've got some time to look over that. If there's any questions, I'll try to answer those. And if there's anything that you kind of see in there that's maybe worth talking about, we can talk about that Thursday or Friday. Cool. That's what I got. So back to 100% here. Format.
The last techniques that we for another day, or
So we talked about this on the work that how to do 50 to look at how to do authorization. If you're looking at this, then it's about. So we kind of talked about this. That's just some reminders of what we. Cool. Yeah. So look at the last page of the handout. That will give you quarters of what you need to do for that. What I'll incorporate in on the last page. 5.1. So short answer is, yeah, we kind of went over all those 2 pages. We just kind of covered them more spread out. Okay. Boop. And so we've been kind of a scramble trying to get everything.